Friends, welcome to another Pints with Jack Skype session. And this week, when we dive into this... Oh, what's wrong?
I left my scotch.
Oh, go grab it.
You introduce it. I'm going to go get my scotch.
Friends, welcome to another Pints with Jack Skype session where I am joined by my friend Andrew Lazo. We'll be enjoying a glass of scotch. And what's important about today's date as we drink this scotch is it is Sunday, November 22nd. And Andrew, what is important about November 22nd?
Well, perhaps more important in my communion than in others, but in 2003, this day, 22nd of November, was named the Lesser Feast of C.S. Lewis, because of course on this day, in fact, right around this time when we're recording, it was 5:30 in England. So right around now, maybe a little bit earlier, Lewis passed away. And maybe your listeners don't know that he passed away within an hour or two of the assassination of John F. Kennedy.
And a third person that we're going to talk about, Aldous Huxley.
Maybe you all had to read. As kids in high school, Brave New World. But Aldous and Julian Huxley were important figures in philosophy and science in England in the 20th century. But they all three died on that same day. And so we'll talk a little bit about what happened 7 years ago today at the 50th anniversary of Lewis's death at Westminster Abbey. But I wanted to start by showing you this wonderful gift I was given. A dear friend of mine gave me a very generous gift, which allowed me to commission an icon to be painted. And I'm here in Sarasota, Florida, where I did my summer work. And one of the parishioners at Church of the Redeemer is Christine Hales, and we'll include a link. She's a well-known iconographer, has done installations all around the country, and she's got a number of icons and a number of commissions. So my friend's gift allowed me to commission this icon. She just delivered it to me, gave it to me yesterday, and then this morning at Church of the Redeemer, Father Wilson blessed it. And so here is an icon of C.S. Lewis.
Real quick, too, was it intentional to give it to you and bless it the day of C.S. Lewis's death, or is this a pure coincidence?
No, this is actually, if you believe in coincidence, which I don't, I consider it a divine appointment. In July, I asked Christine, who's become a friend. We had met and to talk about icons, and she was longing someday to do an icon of Lewis. She loves Lewis. And then when my gift came in, I said, hey, can I commission you to do this? And so we laughed and talked about it. I sent her some recordings of Lewis's voice. I sent her a few different pictures. So if you can see it, maybe you know the pictures of Lewis well enough. You know that picture of him smoking his pipe? Where he's lighting his pipe, that look in his eye is something that I really wanted to go for. Lewis said that he had that look he always had that look about him that people told him to wipe off his face. And so there's
Dare I say that iconic look?
Indeed. And in fact, if you see it, Lewis is not actually looking at us. He's looking a little off to the side. But Ashlyn there that she put is looking at us. So there's a famous picture of him sitting in a chair with a book, but Christine also added some of the bookcases from other photos. And so she really, I think, did a beautiful job. If listeners want and viewers want a copy, there are prints available on her website. So we'll include that address, and you can order a print. But for me, an icon is a way to kind of look through to see the reality of the God behind the life of a person. And we're all in that ways icons. We're all reflections of God. We all have halos because God has chosen to shed his glory upon us. And so for me, it's not about idolatry, but it's about looking through Lewis's life. I see him as a door and a doorway into so many good things about the Lord. And so just a celebration today to share that with you on this good day.
Oh, I'm so glad you did. And tell us about the celebration at 2003.
2013, sorry.
13. I
Yeah,
was close.
It's okay. I was told there'd be no math in podcasting. So in 2013, after years of effort, Michael Ward was able to convince Westminster Abbey, he and a number of others, to place a memorial stone in Poets' Corner. Poets' Corner is where they gather all of the literary luminaries of English life. And so Eliot is there, and Wordsworth and Shakespeare. Some are actually buried there, and some have memorial stones. I was sitting right by Lord Byron. And on the 50th anniversary, they had a ceremony in Westminster Abbey, and they unveiled a memorial stone, and they included the quote, "I believe in Christianity as I believe the sun is risen, not only because I see it, but by it I see everything else." And Rowan Williams, the former Archbishop of Canterbury, was there. Michael Ward was there. Walter Hooper was there. Douglas Gresham was there. And I wasn't anybody special. I just had the general admission tickets. And so I went in and got the best seat that I could, as close to the memorial stone as could be. But as it happens, I sat directly behind Douglas Gresham, who I've known for a few years, mostly through correspondence. And I was right across the transept from all of the photographers and videographers. And so A.N. Wilson recently did a biography of Lewis, and he opens with the memorial stone, and there I am kind of looking around. I wasn't trying to be on camera, but those who know me know that I'm not unwilling to photobomb. So I met Simon Barrington Ward, who was a bishop and who sat with Lewis at Magdalen College, Cambridge, every day at table. Saw him again and got a picture with him. Diana Glyer was there. Jerry Root was there. Gauze Guinness, so many others. Malcolm Geit. It was just this remarkable, remarkable day. And I think the thing that struck me the most, and I've talked with Michael Ward about this, there were two things. The Magdalen Boys Choir sang Veni Sanctus Spiritus, Come Holy Spirit. And that's the opening track on the soundtrack for Shadowlands. So if you listen to that, that was what was sung there in Westminster Abbey. The boys' choir came out from Oxford. And then also, they played a recording of Lewis's voice. And I was just struck to tears by, it was the only time in the history of the world where Lewis's voice would be booming out in Westminster Abbey. And there we all were. And so it was just a glorious day. And to have Lewis there as a writer, as a poet, as the author of the Chronicles of Narnia, and so many other great things, that to me was just a huge blessing. So thanks for letting me go on and on about
Well, no, thanks for sharing that story. I love that. And we'll talk about here a little bit in the Skype session, the book Between Heaven and Hell. And it's by Peter Kraft.
Yeah.
We'll end up keeping it high level. But as we mentioned, today is the day that Lewis, Aldous Huxley, and Kennedy all passed. And so Peter Kraft wrote this beautiful book between these three individuals. And he had each of them, based on their lives, somewhat represent a different philosophy. So you had Lewis, more the Western theism. You have Kennedy, the Western humanism. And as Peter puts, you have Aldous Huxley, which is the ancient Eastern pantheism. And it's a fascinating conversation where they all meet in this afterlife. And is this hell? Is this heaven? Is this purgatory? So there's an interesting conversation, a lot of rhetoric, the main question they discuss is the identity of Christ. And it's a conversation back and forth. So you've read this book, correct?
Yeah, it's been a few years, but Peter Kraft does some wonderful work. He's up in Boston. He's a literature professor. He's a Catholic and a wonderful guy on Lewis, but he's written dozens and dozens of books. So it's KR. Hold that book up again, just so our viewers can see it. Kraft, Peter Kraft, worth anything that a lot of his books worthy of your attention. I saw him live once in Houston, and he said one of the greatest things I've ever heard a Lewis speaker say. He said, "My job is to sell C.S. Lewis books." And so on the book table, there were none of his books, not even this one, but there was just the books that he was talking about: Screwtape, Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, and Mere Christianity. And I just admire that so much. Peter Kraft has been a great friend for the C.S. Lewis Foundation. And I think this take on looking at the Eastern pantheism, all is God, the kind of, Hindu, the view, the Western humanism, although Kennedy was a Catholic, he wasn't really known for his religious writings or outlook. and Lewis, and to have them all kind of in conversation with each other somewhere in the abyss, I think is just a wonderful conceit, a wonderful idea. And what did you think of it when you read it?
Well, first, I absolutely loved it because it was very much based on Lewis. And you can say this better than I can, but was it Professor Kirk? Was he the logician that trained Lewis?
Professor Kirk was Diggory in The Magician's Nephew, and he was the professor in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. You're thinking of William T. Kirkpatrick, the Great Knock. But certainly there's much of Kirk, I think, is much of the Knock is based on Kirkpatrick, absolutely. And he was this atheist who was a rigorous dialectician. This is this fancy 50-cent word that means you learn by arguing. And that's the way that Lewis and Tolkien, a lot in the Oxford and Cambridge, especially early in the century, were trained. And so you remember in Surprised by Joy that Lewis makes a comment and Kirkpatrick roars out, "Stop! What do you know about this? And what books have you read about that?" Mm-hmm. And he really taught Lewis how to argue. He was an atheist who kind of helped further Lewis's atheism, but he also taught Lewis how to think clearly. And it was that rationalism that ended up, I think, leading Lewis to the Lord many years later.
Well, and it was that I believe Peter attempted to channel in here, because when you have this dialogue between these three individuals, you'll have Aldous Huxley bring something up like heaven is everywhere as long as you're enlightened enough to see it. And then Lewis will push back and say, like, what do you mean by that? Explain that. And then he'll explain it, and then he'll say, do you see the flaws in that statement? And then Lewis will go, okay, what about this? And Kennedy will chime in. So it's a really interesting dialogue where every key point, because they talk about hell and how can a God of love create a hell? And so there's multiple pages of that conversation going on. And the other two characters are providing the counter, sometimes, at least in the case of Kennedy, the more modern view of it. And then Lewis says, no, let me point out how that's wrong, except he doesn't quite say it that way. Or they talk about how could a person actually choose hell? Because that's, which is a pretty tough conversation to have. What is purgatory? What about surrendering to authority, the power of authority, the divinity of Christ? All of these topics were covered in here. And the beauty is the whole book is progressing you through to make you, by the end of it, realize if Christ is divine, it calls a certain type of change in your life out of you. And it first gets you to believe that it's very logical, rational progression that gets you to believe that in his divinity. The liar, lunatic Lord. He explains that in depth. He provides all the counters in the book, but then Lewis counters the counters. And it comes to the end of like, all right, well, now you live a certain way. It talks about the validity of Scripture. It's a powerful book. I really like it. It's a book you can give to anyone who's needs logic and ration to believe in Christ and Christianity.
Well, and I think that all of these, and you and David will drink a toast to me. I think that the best book to use when talking about this is The Great Divorce, because when he talks about heaven and hell, and between heaven and hell is the book, that wonderful quote from The Great Divorce, which is really, it owes its goodness to the fact that it's such a good preparation for him to write Till We Have Faces.
Well done.
That's why it's so good. It's because it's a great precursor
to his best book.
I can see, yes, far and away my best book, Lewis, called Till We Have Faces. But this idea that when Lewis says no one who seriously and constantly desires joy will ever miss it. And that was a revolution to me when I read Great Divorce, because I had a rather narrow view that it was only Christians and only my kind of Christians and only my sub-kind of my kind of Christians, and everybody else they put in a room, and heaven belonged to us. And this kind of exclusivity of heaven. Now, there really is an exclusivity of heaven, and you only will get to heaven if Christ has paid the price for you to enter in. He is the way. Please don't hear me saying anything other than that. But the idea that God will thrust heaven on anyone who will stand for it, and created hell not for humans. Remember what Jesus said, hell was created for the devil and his angels. It wasn't created for us. And so in Problem of Pain, when Lewis says that the gates of hell are locked from the inside, right? It's our own choosing. It's our own choosing that sends us to hell and that keeps us there. And I think that's what Lewis so clearly portrays in The Great Divorce. And that's kind of what you see in this book, isn't it?
Mm-hmm. Well, he brings in the great, me loving The Great Divorce so much. You see, particularly when he's talking about why we choose hell and heaven, how a God of love can create hell. It sounds so much like The Great Divorce. It's
Yes.
amazing how much that's drawn on it. Reality, ultimate truth, accepting truth. I like this question that it said from there. Anyone who found God uncomfortable, unendurable, anyone who couldn't stand the light, the truth. That was one of Lewis's response to why would anyone choose hell in this book. That's what it was. And I just thought that was exactly what The Great Divorce. Every chapter is a person who finds God uncomfortable, unendurable, and just can't handle the light of truth.
Well, and I think that it goes back to where my theology of Lewis really kind of keeps coming back to, and I don't mean to oversimplify it, but I think that the definition of hell is me. Mm. And I think that the definition of heaven is thou, speaking of God, right? And the opposition to self is love. The opposite of pride is love, right? And heaven is the place where we turn from ourselves to someone else. And hell is the place where I can only find room for me. You know, it's not biblical. I don't even know where the analogy comes from, but it's like they say that people in heaven and people in hell are the same. They have their arms extended and they can't bend their arms. And people in hell starve, and people in heaven eat. But in hell, they starve because they cannot feed themselves. And in heaven, they eat and feast because you feed someone else, right? Love is going out of the self towards the other. And here's what Lewis said in this tiny little poem about hell. God in his mercy made the fixed pains of hell, that misery might be stayed. God in his mercy made eternal bounds and bade its waves no further swell. God in his mercy made the fixed pains of hell. Now think about Pam. She is the best example. Great Divorce is the best example of this. Pam is distraught because God stole her son from her. And all Pam can think about is Pam. And when she gets to heaven and her brother meets her, she's like, well, where's my son? Where's Michael? I want him with me. And man, I don't know if your listeners saw The Great Divorce the other day. Max McLean and Fellowship for Performing Arts put out a performance that I've seen on stage many times of The Great Divorce. And Pam would take her son from heaven down to hell to be with her. That's not love, that's selfishness. Right? And so Lewis says in many places that hell would infect heaven, and hell doesn't want anybody to be happy because I'm so miserable. And you see that in Pam. And that's, I think, a little bit of what Lewis is voicing in the face of Kennedy's humanism and Huxley's pantheism. And he's trying to correct these mistaken notions.
You need that boundary. So hell, like you said, so hell can't hold heaven hostage. We can't, because it was in The Great Divorce, or wasn't The Great Divorce? Maybe. Or it was, I think it was at the end. Well, don't the people in heaven pity the people in hell? Well, if they do, then the people in hell have the people in heaven held hostage.
Misery can't be allowed to infect happiness, right? It doesn't take a whole lot of dirt to spoil an ice cream cone. Right?
That's a good quote.
But God's willing to give you a dirt-free ice cream cone if only you will prefer the ice cream over the dirt, right? The dwarves would not be taken in and they would not participate in the feast. And I love that Kraft kind of did this. And I think it's worth honoring Lewis on this day by calling attention to the fact that on this day, Lewis finally entered into his rest, something that the disgruntled could never do.
Well, for time's sake, that was enough to tease the people on the book. But I have a feeling we could do other Skype sessions on whether it would be authority, whether it would be on the divinity of Christ. There's so much in this book, guys. We strongly encourage you to check it out. It's fantastic. It's very Lewisian, if that's a word. Check it out.
It is.
But Andrew, thank you for joining. Thank you for this conversation. And what a way to let's cheers.
Cheers to Jack.
Cheers to Jack on the day
that
he
he was promoted to, and a saint's day is the day of their death. And so it's the day of their promotion. So here's to Saint Jack on the day of his promotion.
To Saint Jack.
And to all our listeners too. We'll see you all soon.
See you soon, guys.